walk away. That was my first and last mistake. I'm blue without your face. But what can I do? 'Cause I'm just a sinking ship, and you're just a pair of lips that I've lost in the moment. All I want is for you to come back. Now I'm caught in the middle of life, and I need you to.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, your brother, and your friend Rashid, and this is my guy, Scott of Kalibrated. How's it going today, Scott?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to have a conversation about a lot today. We got a lot to talk about.
Hey, well, let's just jump it off. Scott, what is your take on, first of all, the Trump administration and how it seems like they're going rogue, and they're just bombing off the coast of Venezuela, but now the Colombian government, which was an ally of the United States, says that the U.S. bombed Colombians and not Venezuelans. So, and Trump is now saying that the Colombian government is lying. So, where do we stand with this? Is this just America going completely rogue?
Yeah, so this, I wouldn't say necessarily that America is going rogue. I think that this is sort of, I mean, in my personal opinion, this is sort of the prediction, the path that I thought we were going to go down. The U.S. as a hegemonic state is running out of time. We can see this with our actions through Israel in the Middle East. We can see, the bombing of Iran. We can see the pivot towards China, the division of labor taking over in Europe, where we are now selling weapons through Europe to Ukraine. And Venezuela is just another one of these tertiary regimes that does not align with U.S. interests directly, say like Mexico or Colombia, like you just mentioned, who, well, they're not, allies of the United States, but whatever the U.S. wants to happen in these regions, they tend to go along with it. Venezuela is one of the naysayers, like Russia, like Iran, like China, in that they follow their own interests more or less. And regime change in Venezuela is not a new idea. This has been a consistent U.S. foreign policy practice since, at least for the last 15 years, 2010, 2012, somewhere around there. I don't know if you remember Juan Guaido, who is now comfortably resting in Miami. He is the legitimate president of Venezuela that is in exile, who was never actually the president of Venezuela, just a U.S. puppet that we were planning on replacing the Venezuelan president with years ago. Now we are coming back to this sort of idea of regime change in Venezuela. We are doing so under the auspices of a narco or drug war, which is a complete farce. If you understand anything about the narco situation in South America and in Mexico, we would have much better, we would have a much easier job, and it would be much more efficient to deal with the problems closer to the U.S. first, and then work our way south into Venezuela and all of these other places. Drugs do not immediately come from Venezuela or Colombia into the United States. That's rarely how it happens. They usually go from these places to third-party countries that share land borders or close sea connections with the United States, like Mexico, and that's how the drugs get up in here. So the idea that we are killing these drug dealers or these narco boat operators to prevent these drugs from reaching the United States is just illogical in and of itself. I have been a very vocal critic of the attacks on these boats. One, because it violates our own international law. If it was any other country in the world doing this, we would be sanctioning that country like nobody's business. If this was the Chinese striking narco boats that the Philippines were operating, we would be sanctioning China over this. We would be talking about humanitarian rights, all of this other stuff. But when we do it, we don't care. Even JD Vance on Twitter was talking about these strikes on a narco boat, and somebody basically came forward and said, yeah, that's by definition a war crime. And JD Vance replied, verbatim, I don't give a shit what you call it. So this is the U.S. government doing what the U.S. government has always done. The only difference now is we have a populace in the United States who are much more critical of the current U.S. government and U.S. foreign policy, as well as having access to cell phones, just unfettered information, which quite consistently contradicts the government's narrative on these sort of projects, right? And back to the Venezuela thing specifically, destroying 4 or 5 narco boats is not going to prevent the flow of drugs coming into your country. 4 or 5 of those narco boats get pulled over by police in international waters and get confiscated. They're sending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these boats weekly, right, to get drugs. The drug trade is massive and basically undeterrable unless you do it from your own border. The whole idea and the whole operation in international waters off the coast is to stage for a eventual regime change operation or to assist in a popular revolution, which popular revolution is just a term for a CIA-led and NGO-funded operation like we're seeing in Georgia right now, or like we saw in Ukraine with Maidan. I don't believe that we will actually see any kinetic action from the U.S. against Venezuela. I don't think they have any right to do that. But you can see how they're trying to set the stage for some sort of action. And one of the biggest tells is in May, we designated the cartel. I can't remember the specific cartel, the Sangria, something cartel in Venezuela, a terrorist organization. And in doing so, we can extrajudiciously kill whoever we want, wherever we want, because they are members of a terror organization. Not only this, but the Venezuelan president was also randomly connected with this terror organization, drug cartel, which makes him a leader and a member of a terror organization. So now the legitimate government of Venezuela, according to the US, is a terror organization or closely intertwined with a terror organization. This has nothing to do with narcotics. This has everything to do with oil and resources and a regime in South America, which poses a threat to U.S. hegemony, just like Iran poses a threat to U.S. hegemony in the Middle East, just like Russia poses a threat to U.S. hegemony in Europe, and just as China poses a threat to U.S. hegemony and global trade in the South China Sea.
But since there's such a big military naval buildup down there, and we know that these things are not free, we know that the United States is accumulating massive debt. How long do you think that she can posture before doing anything, or just taking the troops away and focusing on her goals in the Middle East to try to subjugate Iran?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a great question, and I wish I had more insider information so I knew where to look at all times. And I think this is also part of their ongoing plans and sort of just the operational nature of what U.S. foreign policy is right now. The U.S. is creating chaos all over the place. Like I said, obviously you have Ukraine, you have Georgia, you have Iran, Lebanon, Yemen, the whole Middle East, the South China Sea area. You know, we just had the popular revolution in Nepal, where now 4 of the 8 new leadership, or 5 of the 8 new leadership in the country and the new government are all funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a U.S. foreign NGO. If for those of your listeners who don't know, NGOs are basically a way for the U.S. government to dump money and information into foreign countries, right? And Georgia just went through their FARS Act, like we have ours, to register foreign agents. And we don't like that very much because that means we can't pump money into Georgia. So that's why those protests are now happening in Georgia. And I imagine we are going to see something similar in the Venezuela area, because there is a anti-government faction there that will be utilized against Venezuela. Now, when we're talking about how long the U.S. has, how long can it posture, That's a really good question. I mean, if you're looking at the economic side of things, we're already way past the dot-com bubble, where our situation is looking worse than the 2008 housing market crash. I don't know how it's sustaining itself right now. I think it's mostly fake at this point. I think all of the world's governments are shifting. I think the ideas that we look at the present in need to change dramatically. This is no longer a post-Soviet Cold War US hegemony peaceful world, peaceful world. This is a newer multipolar landscape where economics are going to be different, trade is going to be different. There are going to be massive disruptions all over the place, and the sort of ideas that we previously had might not play out, that the pattern recognition might not be the same as the world is changing. However, we are seeing how the US is struggling to maintain multiple fronts in this war that it is currently fighting. It is trying to achieve some sort of peace in Gaza because of how just terrible the PR around that whole situation has become. It is deplorable to the point where the US is the only country who will stand up for Israel. All of these other states are recognizing Palestine and all of this. And not to make this about Israel and Gaza, but this is just an example of how the US is stopping their puppets from exercising however they want in their regions, right? We need you to pull back from Gaza. We need to make statements about how you're sorry to Qatar. In Ukraine, they have nothing else to give Ukraine. They are struggling to manage the Ukraine situation as we speak. Manufacturing hasn't increased enough. So you have Iran, you have Ukraine and Russia. Russia's just getting stronger. They are currently bogged down, but if Ukraine ends, Russia is going to be free and loose. And then you are talking about potentially going to war with Venezuela while also shifting and pivoting to the South China Sea. I think the U.S. has probably less than a decade at most, of this sort of posturing, where we will see us acting hyper aggressive all over the world, trying to maintain our positions. And then after that decade, I think you're going to see a forced recession back into not an isolationist position, but probably more of a hemispheric power, where the U.S. sort of dominates the Western hemisphere and then China dominates the Eastern hemisphere. So I don't know how long we have necessarily. We can manufacture time basically with how we print money and how we just say, well, the economy is doing good, even though we're 30 trillion in debt, or is it 40 trillion now? Is it 40 or 30?
It's close. It's 37 or 38.
Yeah, so close to 40 trillion in debt. I don't even, and who do we owe that to? And everybody else is in debt. It's just a very illusionary system in my mind. Even the money we use is just an illusion. It's not even backed by anything. So I don't think we have a lot of time, but I do think things are going to get much more aggressive, much more chaotic, and much more dangerous over the next half decade as the U.S. scratches and claws to maintain its hegemony and its global presence.
See, and that was one of the points that I wanted to make, that the U.S. is losing time. She's behind time because the economics is not on her side anymore. The politics, global politics, is not on her side. And if you look at her adversaries, they have what she have, and in some ways they have things that she has not been able to fill yet. So doesn't this make the empire more dangerous? Because when you look at it, you brought up something about the NGOs and in Georgia, and how Georgia made them register, and we see that as a fad, but that was actually started in the Sahel, registering these nations that were breaking free of colonial power. They wanted to register these NGOs, and this is what pissed France and Germany and all the rest of them off. And now we're seeing Latin America reaching into that, and we see, as you say, the Central Caucasus area doing it. Does that not put America in a very peculiar situation when it comes to this? Because America depends on a lot of nations for a lot of gratuity to buy her debt. her recent bond sale did not get a lot of attention because it failed. So this shortens the time span that she has to try to implement her goals. So maybe this is what I'm trying to say is this one of the reasons that she is throwing everything at the wall in different places to see if something will stick to keep her hegemonic position in certain areas?
Absolutely. I think the clearest indication of this is, and just in the U.S. domestic population is what I want you to think about when I talk about this. Look at how Israel is behaving. Israel is behaving like October 7th is their last opportunity to seize complete control in the Middle East, overthrow the axis of resistance, right? What did October 7th have to do with Lebanon? What did October 7th have to do with Iran? You know, Hamas is funded and kept in power by Israel and Qatar. So you're talking about this axis of evil just because they're all Muslims. But really, the idea is destabilize these countries in the Middle East, destabilize this axis of resistance so that Israel will be incredibly strong in the anticipation of what we've already seen happen over the last 2 years. Gaza just accelerated this. But anybody under the age of 60 in America is pretty much against Israel and Israel's pull in our politics and how our politicians work with them. It's mostly a boomer activity to support Israel at this point, and there's a minority of the evangelical Christians in America that also support Israel because of projects that were set up to reinforce those ideas. So that whole population is dying, and the U.S. will not be supporting Israel as unconditionally as we have been since the 60s or 70s. Right. That's going to go away. And that's just going to go away because sentiment towards Israel has never been more negative. I don't know if you've experienced this at all, but conversations that used to be like taboo, I'm hearing in like barbershops and grocery stores, just the craziest things, like the stuff that Candace Owens is talking about, reaching a whole different demographic of people. Just the entire U.S. population is turning on Israel in this way. Not our government, very clearly, and that's pissing a lot of people off, but the general ideas towards Israel. And this is just a microcosm. Israel is a specific instance where they have a support base in the U.S., but the idea of U.S. hegemony, the idea of forever wars and empire wars all over the world is becoming so negative because our lives here are just getting worse day by day. Groceries are getting more expensive. Housing's getting more expensive. More people are renting than ever before. See, back in the day, when your government was doing all of this really shitty stuff, first off, you didn't see it on your cell phone all day.
Right.
You just heard whatever the news told you. And the other thing is you were willing to put up with all of that maybe evil or bad stuff. It's far away. It's not really your problem because you have the ability to have a full family, have a little patch of grass that you call your own, a house, you have a good job, you have a retirement fund, your kids are being sent to college. Things are really good, right? So you're willing to accept more of the negative political stuff, the geopolitical stuff, or just not be as interested in it because it's not affecting you negatively. But now, and especially with my generation and younger, because I'm not necessarily a Zoomer, I'm a little bit older than that, but I'm not a millennial either. I have never heard anybody talk good about Israel in my age, like demographic, ever. And these are not the people that I'm hanging out with. I don't bring this topic up. It is now just a normal thing. And this is what is going to happen with Ukraine. This is what is going to happen with every future U.S. war that occurs, unless we have some sort of 9/11. And this is what I'm very, very concerned about. I'm very concerned about a 9/11 perhaps in Europe that is blamed on Russia in some way. I'm also very, very concerned about some sort of large scale attack in America that gets a lot of people very, very scared and very angry, and that you can direct that hate towards a country like we did with Afghanistan and Iraq, right? What did Iraq have to do with 9/11? Nothing. but you manufacture that consent and you go to war. So I do definitely agree that the U.S. is running out of time, and they are vicious. We are vicious, and this is something that people just don't seem to understand. Anybody outside of the U.S., I've seen this time and time again. I know it's difficult to go against the U.S., but this naivety in diplomacy and negotiations with the U.S., time and time again over the last 5 years in particular, has proven to be a faulty misstep for every country that's gone about it. Iran tried to negotiate with the U.S. They got their nuclear facilities bombed in the middle of those negotiations. The Hamas tried to negotiate with the U.S. They got bombed in Tehran. They got bombed in Qatar, a U.S. ally, and they got the ceasefire just completely dissolved in Gaza itself. Look at Lebanon, the ceasefire there, it's still going on, and Israel bombs Lebanon daily, right? During the negotiations on Ukraine with Russia, when Putin came to Alaska and stuff, what happened? The Ukrainians used that for that Operation Spiderweb, where they destroyed Russian strategic nuclear aviation just to escalate the conflict. So this is a common trope, and I think that unfortunately people need to start treating us like a rabid animal. Like, don't touch us, don't get near us. If our actions prove to you that we are doing the right thing, then maybe talk with us and move along with us. But until that happens, I would never trust a word any U.S. politician says ever.
Shout out to Red Panda Pie for the 30 € super chat. Thank you so much. And you say thank you for what you do and keep going. We'll keep going. Now, I wanted to bring this point up to you because this, to me, this is something that is overlooked a lot in the conversation. Okay, Trump came on the mantra of no more wars. He came making the deficit smaller, less spending. But there was an article that came out 2 days ago that said during the Gaza conflict, the United States appropriated $21.7 billion to Israel. Now, and the reason I brought this up is because they are cutting health benefits for kids, for seniors, for people who served in the military. People, I know for a fact there are people having problems getting medication and being seen at the VA and all of this stuff like this. Now, when will Trump get blamed for some of this? Because everybody continues to say Hexif. Everybody continues to say Rubio. And we see that, as George Bush Jr. says, the buck stops here. I'm the boss. And so Trump is the boss, and every promise that he came in on, he has tossed it to the wind. And as his base started splitting, remember, his base started splitting in half over the Epstein files. Then we get the Charlie Kirk assassination, and then we have the deployment of troops to the Middle East. We see the more deployment of troops off the coast of Venezuela. Is this a Bill Clinton moment when he was in trouble to keep the spotlight off of Epstein and the relationships? Because it's so many things that are connected that seems like that nobody is bringing up Epstein anymore. Nobody is bringing up his connection with Epstein. Nobody is talking about the corruption that is going on in the U.S. Government. Nobody is talking about the immediate appropriations of money to Israel, while there was a HUD study that said it would take $20 billion to alleviate poverty, to alleviate homelessness across America, and then another $20 billion to eradicate poverty completely. So you can appropriate $21.7 billion, $1.7 billion more than is needed to eradicate homelessness across the United States, and you still have a base. When will this blow back on Mr. Orange Hair himself?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think that for the most part, I think that you are seeing that blowback definitely come his way. It's not going to be in the media. You're never going to see it there. You're never going to see it in, you're never going to hear him admit it. You're never going to see the people around him talk about it. And those are the people that get most of the time and attention, right? But I mean, like you said, his base is already divided. His approval rating is through the floor. They lied about Epstein. They lied about JFK. He obviously did not do enough when it came to Ukraine, because Putin put forward a very, 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 very reasonable plan. And this is what I want people to understand, is that it's not really Trump. Trump is just the face. Trump is just the person that can rally, that can emotionally tug at people. He is a good talker. He is a good communicator in the way that he does it. I don't mean that he's like super articulate or anything, but people really like him. He's outside of the normal suit and tie politician. But just as you talked about, all of those promises not kept. He promised no more wars. He bombed Iran, which has been like a conversational no-no in the U.S. government. Like, don't bomb Iran for 20 years. This has been a consistent position. So went ahead and did that. He continued bombing Yemen, just like Obama, just like Bush, just like Trump in the first administration. It's always happened. He continues to bomb all of these other countries. He's providing all of the weapons, all of the bombs that are being dropped on Gaza. So he is complicit in a genocide, and he was for over a year. So people are saying that he's a great peacemaker or whatever. All he had to do to create peace was to stop allowing the bombs to be sent. You could send everything for defense, send air defense missiles, all that. But why are you sending 2,000-pound bombs for Israel to drop on Palestinian homes? Right? That he's continuing to do that. He is now continuing to arm and support Ukraine. Ukraine uses all of our satellite data and information, all of our ISR. Our reconnaissance aircraft fly over the Black Sea and designate targets for the Ukrainians to strike. That is us. We are fully complicit and working with the Ukrainians to fight the Russians. Without us, the Ukrainians would have literally collapsed. They wouldn't have had satellite information. They wouldn't have had artillery shells. If you've looked at Ukraine at all recently, which is kind of my area, there is no more Soviet vehicles on the battlefield. It's all NATO equipment. It is a NATO proxy war against Russia, right? So there's just no he hasn't followed through with a single promise that he has made, other than maybe the immigration ICE stuff, which I think is basically the easiest thing to do, right? Getting illegal criminals out of the streets and securing our border is pretty much a bipartisan agreement in the United States, unless you're so anti-Trump that you think having an open border is a good thing. I think everybody agrees that you don't want murderers and drug dealers from other countries just rampaging through like Colorado and stuff like they were. He kept that promise, but that is super easy and super popular to follow through on. Every other promise he has not. And I want you to think, is it Trump lying? Or does Trump just have absolutely no say in what actually happens? He might give the final nod to something, but he's not planning operations. He's not planning the operation to bomb Iran. He's not planning the operation to bomb Yemen. He's not supplying Ukraine with stuff. He's a president. He's a businessman politician. He's not micromanaging any of this. There is a continuity of agenda where you are voting for a uniparty. President Trump is no different than Obama, Trump, then Biden, then Trump, then Obama, then Bush. They've all done the same thing. They've all continued the forever wars. Their job is to maintain the hegemony. They are not brought in to derail the entire process and restart everything. That's not how nations operate. That's how nations fall apart, right? You can't just backtrack. I always use this analogy that a country's foreign policy is like a train on a set of tracks, right? There's some turns where you can go this way or this way every now and then. You have some options, but the general direction is always the same. You can't pull a U-turn, and if you start going back, it's going to be slow and it's going to be miserable and painful, right? It's always forward, and especially when you're talking about the neocons and maintaining the hegemony, it is always double down. It is always be more aggressive. It is just force your way, force your way, force your way, force your way. And that's what we were seeing in Venezuela, striking those narco boats. That's what you're seeing in the Middle East with Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, Yemen. That is what you're seeing in Ukraine. And I promise you and your audience that in the next 3 to 5 years, you will see either Thailand, Cambodia, Nepal, India, Pakistan, or the Philippines become extremely hostile to China or get into a regional war with each other, which destabilizes China's entire border region. Guys, this is what they tried to do to Russia. It failed so far. It's still in the process. It could still succeed. They wanted regime change in Russia. They caused problems in Azerbaijan and Armenia. They caused problems in Syria, which is a direct Russian ally. Syria fell, which disrupted Iran as well. That was a major thing. And that happened because Russia was distracted with Ukraine, right? They tried to do the same thing in Belarus. They will do the same thing in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and particularly Georgia, which has already been used in 2008 against Russia and is trying to be overthrown to be used against them once again. This is U.S. foreign policy. You can go read our policy papers. You can go listen to what Pete Hegseth said in February in Brussels to all of NATO when he was talking about the US's plans going forward. It's not a secret. I'm not an insider. I don't have any information. I just listen to what they say and I watch their actions. And I don't mean listen to what they say in tweets, because that's not real. Listen to what they say when they're on a podium in front of all of their peers and they're actually talking about their plans.
Flying Crocodile says, hey there, Rashid. Remind us all about where we can buy merchandise to support the channel. It's on the channel. You can connect there, or you can go to the Patreon, and whether you're subscribed or not, and you can get the link or whatever. I really appreciate that. Now I want to go to your forte, your expertise on Ukraine.
Yeah.
I hear a lot of alternative media programs talking about how Ukrainian intelligence is feeding false information to the West. And my thing is, how is that even possible when the United States and NATO have boots on the ground covertly? They have taken over all of the government institutions and intelligence agencies. They feed the real-time intelligence. They have the satellites. And as you said, they have the AWACS that fly across the Black Sea. So in that some way, putting more onus on the puppet instead of the puppeteers to say that the reason Trump or the U.S. is becoming aggravated or saying what they're saying, even though what they're saying is against reality, is because they're being fed false intelligence by the Ukrainian intelligence services, when in reality, the intelligence that the Ukrainian intelligence services get is from the U.S. and NATO.
Yep. Yeah. So just to specify, there's going to be two kinds of different intelligences. There's going to be like strike data, satellite intelligence, which is going to come from the U.S. to Ukraine. And then you're going to have frontline intelligence like casualties, which the U.S. might not have as good of an idea on, because there's not necessarily like lieutenants and sergeants on the front lines from the United States that are overseeing and managing all of the casualties and everything. So that information could definitely be fudged. But I want to just take a step back and talk about like Vietnam for a second. Think about the intelligence that was coming out of Vietnam. That was our own intelligence. Our intelligence services were not only being lied to by their own military about casualty ratios and how the war was going, but they were also then lying to the decision makers, the policy makers in Washington, because the CIA is not an intelligence organization. It is a political tool that has access to all of the intelligence available. It's two different things, right? The CIA is not there to inform the president of what is really going on. The CIA is there to prepare basically a PowerPoint presentation with all of the important bullet points that they want to get across to the president. They say those things, and then the president makes a decision based off of that intelligence. So I would be hesitant to say that it's just Ukrainian intelligence lying. I think that there are plenty of people in the CIA and MI6 that have immense investments in different military industrial complex companies in all of these different assets who are going to be making insane profit or have furthering career opportunities or whatever the selfish reason is to lie to the president. There's also, like we talked about, the continuity of agenda, where even if the president is getting the proper information when it comes to Ukraine, or whoever's making the decisions when it comes to Ukraine, even if they are getting the proper information, do they care? Do they care how many Ukrainians are dying? They probably know a rough estimate of what the real casualties are, right? Do they care? Do they really think Ukraine can take back its land from Russia? No, that's not the idea. The idea is to bog down and weaken Russia, use Ukraine as a battering ram to blunt and slow down Russia, hopefully cause regime change and economic collapse inside of Russia, and then use Russia against China. The opposite has happened, where China and Russia are now energy partners and in a pretty strong alliance. And as you said, this is actually accelerating the US running out of time, because now there is an alternative in the world. You have China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, who are all working together. Even India is on side with Russia when it comes to their economic benefit, right? India is going to continue buying Russian oil, refining it, and selling it to Europe because they are making unbelievable amounts of money. Why wouldn't they? That is in their national interest. That is not in the US national interest. So we will go against them on that. But there is this alternative, we would call it multipolar. I don't know if it's really multipolar because it's not quite there yet. The US is still the hegemony, but there is now an alternative. As soon as you see Russia or China create an alternative banking system, you will see a multitude of countries begin to disobey the US because there's just no threat of sanctioning anymore, right? Everybody can do business with North Korea now. I've said this from the very beginning of the Ukraine war. North Korea is the biggest winner of this entire Ukraine conflict. North Korea was completely isolated because everybody was afraid of sanctions. They had a little bit of smuggling from Russia and China into their country to maintain life and everything, but they were definitely down on their luck, and like any country, like Venezuela was, right? Venezuela was doing really good. They have unlimited oil resources. Venezuela should be super rich, and everybody's like, Venezuela's shitty because of socialism. No, it's because the US sanctioned them into the dirt. That's why they don't have any money. They had a bunch of money and then they don't have it because nobody will buy their oil, right? So that's sort of the idea. And now Venezuela is doing much better since the Ukraine war started, and we lifted those sanctions on Venezuela because we need their oil. So this is a very important thing. But there is this alternative now in the world. So these countries are going to turn away from the US and begin moving towards this multipolar world, if you want it to call it that, but just a world where you can't get bullied by the US every single time you do something that they don't like. That's the reality we are creating. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
I know we were talking about intelligence, but
we'll go into Ukraine just a second, but I also want to make this perfectly clear to everybody. Scott talked about how India is buying up Russian oil and making a ton of money off of it.
Yep.
There were reports that came out yesterday, day before yesterday, and even today that said now, Russia. We knew that Russia and India had a problem transacting ruble and the
rupee.
Rupee.
Yep.
Well, now the Indian corporations are actually buying Russian oil in yuan, Chinese yuan.
Yep.
So now that's going to put more pressure on the United States to up the ante with China. But back for a second to Ukraine. Scott, you do a great job on the maps. You do a great job on analyzing what's going on. What is actually going on? Because we see, it looks like to me that Zelensky is panicked, Trump is panicked, the EU is panicked, the Ukrainian intelligence services is panicking. Is Russia now starting to up the ante and put on that full court press to break NATO and Ukraine?
Yeah. So this is, I'm just going to mention a couple of different things in regards to this. First and foremost, the political situation in Russia has changed dramatically. Up until, even coming up into the Alaska meeting between Putin and Trump, there was this idea that some negotiated settlement could be worked out. That seems to have completely evaporated. You have, I can't remember who came out and said it today, but somebody came out and said that all of the goodwill that was there for the Russia meeting in Alaska, or the Putin-Trump meeting in Alaska, has completely disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore. Ukraine is continuing.
Rabakov, the assistant to Lavrov.
Yes. Thank you. I couldn't remember his name. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. The political situation is changing in Russia. And then when we were talking about strikes, kinetic strikes, you're seeing that Ukraine is continuing to strike at Russian oil infrastructure and gas infrastructure. And they are now targeting electrical infrastructure, civilian electrical infrastructure in Bryansk, Belgorod, some of the border regions. So I don't know what the goal is in that outside of escalation and wanting to get struck more. But in doing so, Ukraine has brought upon themselves an actual infrastructure campaign. We have seen Russia strike at energy infrastructure previously. We saw it in 2022, 2023. We didn't really see it as much in 2024. There was some backdoor deals where Russia wasn't getting struck by Ukrainian drones and Russia wasn't striking electrical infrastructure. And Russia has never really wanted to hurt the Ukrainian people. And in my opinion, that's because they expect that they will eventually occupy all of Ukraine. And you don't want to occupy Ukraine like the U.S. occupied Iraq, right? You want to do it brotherly. You don't want to kill a bunch of civilians. If you look at the civilian casualties in Ukraine through 4 years of industrial scale warfare, it's about 14,000 Ukrainian civilians have died. That's on both sides. So that's not just from Russians killing Ukrainians. That's also from Ukrainians killing Ukrainians. If you remember, this is sort of a civil war. So there are Ukrainians that are being killed by Ukraine. And that is what, 1/8 of what's happened in Gaza in 2 years in terms of civilian casualties. So, you know, when they talk about Russia as being genocidal in Ukraine, that doesn't really seem to be the situation at all. I think it's because they expect to occupy most of Ukraine eventually. Now, when we're talking about Ukraine's military position, first and foremost, they have almost no ability to prevent Russian deep strikes. So Russian missiles and drones basically penetrate their airspace as deep as they want. They can strike anything they choose to. We've seen targets struck all over the country. Ukraine's oil production and storage has been reduced by, I think, around 60%, according to the Ukrainian government. They are now stating that they are going to have to purchase oil and gas from Europe to sustain themselves over this winter, which is a very, very bad thing because Europe is already struggling to get the gas and energy that it needs to sustain itself. It's just getting more expensive. They don't have their cheap Russian oil anymore. So that's going on. You also have the Russians striking at electrical infrastructure at a rate I have never seen, and it's not even winter yet. So I do believe you are going to see serious blackouts, and there are going to be serious complications when it comes to the AFU's ability to manage the entire front line. When we're talking about manpower, the Ukrainians are significantly struggling from manpower shortages. This is apparent all over the map. The Russians are now advancing in multiple different areas faster than I have ever seen in the entirety of the war since 2022 when it first kicked off. We're talking about hundreds of square kilometers a week across the front. There are multiple cities now that are being captured by the Russians. Kupiansk in the north, which the Ukrainians retook in 2022 during their offensive, has now been almost entirely recaptured by the Russians. There is an active Ukrainian encirclement there. The city of Pokrovsk, which is a focal point of this war right now, is also and has been completely surrounded, or surrounded on three sides. The Ukrainians have a very difficult time getting in for months now. That city is looking like it's getting very close to falling. The Russians are now in a new oblast since the last time we talked. That is the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which runs up to the Dnieper River. So they are now in this new oblast. They control about 200 square kilometers of that new territory. The Russians are just finally achieving the military strength that you would expect the Russians to have gone in with initially, right? The Russians are now sitting at around 700,000 active personnel inside of Ukraine, which greatly outnumbers the Ukrainian military. This means that the Russians will be able to consistently attack and absorb any losses that they're taking for a very extended period of time, far beyond what the Ukrainians can take. Also, Russian glide munitions and drones have become a complete nightmare for the Ukrainians all over the place. It's just getting to the, like I always talk about it like it's a snowball, right? In 2022, the Russians threw a little snowball at Ukraine, trying to just get it done quick, get a negotiated settlement, whatever it came out to, and then get out. They didn't want to be in Ukraine for 4 years. Then they chose to mobilize. That's when they decided that they were going to be in Ukraine for a very long time in 2022. Now, all of the manufacturing, the Russian manufacturing has caught up. Chinese manufacturing, North Korean manufacturing, which is also aided by Chinese, logistics, is now benefiting the Russian military. The Russians have everything they need. They have all the people they need, and they are now moving forward. So the situation in Ukraine is getting extremely desperate. I think you are about to see very desperate acts. I think you are seeing that currently from Europe itself. These recent drone incursions into Poland, the MiG-31 Russian aircraft that crossed into Estonian airspace, never even crossed over their land territory, just was flying in between Finland and Estonia and barely crossed into their technical airspace, and then left immediately. And they made it seem like Russia had just attacked Estonia. You have the airport closures in Finland and Germany and Sweden because of Russian drones, which, by the way, we saw a week of those Russian drone activities. Not a single one was shot down. Not a single picture was taken of any of those drones. What they are doing is trying to manufacture consent against the Russians, because Europeans don't want this war. There is no regular European that wants their country to engage Russia in a conflict. This is purely desperate, globalists. I don't even know what you would call it. Whatever you would call the Western alliance is very desperate, and the puppets in Europe, the puppet governments in Europe, are just as desperate as the U.S. is. So expect wild things to happen. This is my idea going forward for the next 5 years, is just expect the craziest things to happen on the level of 9/11, on the level like paradigm shifting events are probably going to happen in the next 5 years.
Well, do you think that these people have become so detached from reality, and they see their world or their global order collapsing, and it's making them go insane? Because Russia is the largest nuclear power on the planet. It has demonstrated weapons that the West does not have, and they are relying on Russia's restraint as they continue to up the ante. And even Obama said that Russia has dominance, escalatory dominance on the European continent. Now, I was talking to Larry Johnson yesterday, and he said we were talking about the possible deployment of the cruise missiles from the United States, Tomahawks.
Yeah.
And I asked him just straight up what would Russia's response would be, and he said that he believed that Russia would use the Oreshnik. And I asked him, only in Ukraine? He said it could strike outside of Ukrainian territory. So these people in power, the average person in Europe wants it to stop, but the people in power are pushing. Where is this going to lead? Because Russia is not going to stop until its security interests are met.
Yep. The way I look at it, it's it appears to me like it's an adult dealing with a child. I mean this in a way that not like they act as though there are no consequences, but they know that there are consequences. They and it's always just pushing the line. It's always just pushing the envelope. When it comes to tomahawks, I don't think you're going to see tomahawks in Ukraine. I think that this is a line that will not be crossed. And the reason why I specifically think that is because this line has been previously approached 2 times actually previously throughout this conflict and was never pushed forward, right? The thing about ATACMS and the thing about Storm Shadow cruise missiles, they are very limited in their range, so they can just attack over the border. They require U.S. strike data, so the U.S. basically gets to choose where and when the Ukrainians use these. And none of these systems there's no implication that they could be nuclear capable. When we're talking about the other systems that I'm referring to, the other 2 that we've seen throughout the conflict is Taurus cruise missiles from Germany. Those were never sent because they're nuclear capable and because they are able to strike Moscow, right? This is a line that the West does not seem to be willing to cross. The second missile that was not sent was the JASSM, the JASSM missile. This is another potentially nuclear capable weapon system that is able to strike at a very long distance and would be considered by Russia, if it flew across their territory, to be a potential nuclear first strike, right? That is what Russian nuclear doctrine states. So Taurus, Tomahawk, and JASSM all fit into that same category. They are the weapon systems that Ukraine wants for that specific reason, not because they want to put a nuke on it, but because of the escalatory nature of the weapon system. They also like the range of the weapon system, right? They want to be able to strike Russian manufacturing or make Moscow feel the war or whatever they want to do. There is a sense of delusion, but I think that the delusional posturing, I guess you would say, is more for public consumption than it necessarily is for, backdoor conversations and real foreign policy. Because you see all of this hysteria, you see the anti-Russian talk, this, that, or the other, but in reality, the U.S. is still buying rare earth minerals from Russia. Europe is still buying Russian energy. It's like a fake war almost. When the world is so globalized, you can't detach yourself from the specific things that a country offers that you need, right? The U.S. needs rare earth minerals. We don't have access to them like we did when we were in control of Afghanistan. We didn't necessarily pull those out, but we had access to them, or when we were in better terms with China, right? So we still need those, and we still need to get them somewhere. Europe still needs energy, needs to get it somewhere, but they just have their fake sanctions and rules. So the delusion is there. The delusion is on the surface, right? But when you start talking about what the CIA is doing and what MI6 is doing and what the real thinkers are doing behind the scenes, they want the war to go in that direction, but they don't want to involve themselves. And this is why you've seen this, right? If there was ever a time for the US to send troops in or Europe to send troops in, they could have got a ceasefire. They could have accepted these terrible agreements, froze the front line, and then just dumped troops into Ukraine and said, Russia, do something about it, right? They don't want to do that. They know it's not going to fly. They know Ukraine is a proxy. They want Ukraine to be destroyed. They do not want Ukraine as a welfare state that's going to suck money from the EU, kind of like Greece, but like 9 times as bad for the next 2 or 3 decades. That's not what they want. They want Ukraine burned and destroyed. They want Russia bogged down. They want Russia the boogeyman. So, yes, the delusion is there. And you do see people who are legitimately delusional, like full on to their core delusional. But those are not usually decision makers. The decision makers behind the scenes are a little bit more, what would you say, self-preservating. They don't want to. They know what they need to do to maintain their position, and they're not going to do delusional, crazy things just because that's what politicians are saying and stuff like that.
Before we go off there, I want to highlight a comment right here, and I want to address it. Then I want you to get your thoughts on it real quick. Eric N says there are plenty of rare earth mines in the U.S. ready to go. Eric, I don't think you understand. There are plenty of rare earths in the United States. It's not the rare earths that is the problem. It's the capacity to refine them and to put them in a usable manner. And it takes a lot of energy, effort, and money. And the United States is not in the position of that at this moment. What do you say about that before we go off there?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, and this goes back to every single aspect of what we've looked at when it comes to Ukraine or any conflict that the U.S. will get into, right? If you look at the U.S. military-industrial complex, it's there. It exists, right? We produce some of the top-end equipment in the world in terms of radars, maybe air defense, definitely aircraft. We are producing some of the best equipment in the world. The issue is we produce very little of it, and it is so expensive that it is not worth making. This is why, the exchange between Iran and Israel was so devastating for the U.S. We burned through like 1/3 of our THAAD ballistic missile interceptors, not 1/3 of our yearly production, because that's 20 interceptors. No, we're talking 1/3 of our global THAAD interceptor, stockpile. And what that means is if we were to get into a war with, say, China or Russia, we would have 2/3 of our total stock, which lasted 12 days against Iran. That's crazy. That's crazy. So we do have military industrial complex. We do have rare earth minerals, but it will take 1 to 2 decades to build the infrastructure required to mass produce or mass refine or do any of this. This stuff just doesn't happen overnight. Just because you have access to it does not mean you have the ability to dig it up, refine it, and then use it in the way you want. Now, as an American, you should be saying that, and you should be saying, yes, let's go start refining these rare earth minerals. Let's start being self-sufficient. Let's have our military industrial complex produce enough shells so that if we go to war for 2 years like the Russians or 4 years, we will never need anybody else ever. We will be able to produce what we need. That is not what the U.S. is right now. And that's why you should be very concerned when we're talking about foreign wars. We do not have the endurance to go fight China. We do not have the endurance to fight Russia. We would have to use nukes, right? So we are in a very vulnerable position unless we can just fully utilize our aircraft carriers and air bases. But when you're fighting a real enemy, those don't exist, right? Mm-hmm. Those get wiped off the board immediately. And when those get wiped off the board, the U.S. will have to use alternative means. So yes, we do have the ability to dig up rare earth minerals, but we're not investing in it because it's cheaper to get it from China and Russia, right? We don't want to build the insane factories and mines that are required to achieve or acquire that resource when it's so much cheaper to buy it from somebody who's already doing it.
Once again, Scott, my man, you hit it out the park, man. We got to do this more often.
Yes, for
now,
sure,
man. We have to, man. I always enjoy your take on things, man. Thank you so much, man. And from the bottom of my heart to the depth of my soul, man, I really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me on, brother. It's always a pleasure.
All right, my man. Be safe. I'll talk to you later, okay?
Take care.
All right, everybody, listen. As we close out, I always say this in closing. Do right by others, not because there's some material gain or some accolades to be had, but do right by others because it's the humane, the right, and the godly thing to do. Because even when no one else is watching you, remember, God Almighty is watching you. And as my late mother says, God sits high, but he looks low. Know that I love each and every one of you who loves truth, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, remember to stay righteous. Like, subscribe, and share. Peace. We're out of here. Thank you. Mama, your baby boy loves you more than life. Deuces, everybody.
Told you to walk away. That was my first and last mistake. I'm blue without your face. But what can I do? 'Cause I'm just a seed. and you're just a pair of lips that I've lost in the moment. All I want is for you to come back. Now I'm caught